Hello everyone. Today I will be discussing one of the four conflicts of drama writing, which is the jumping conflict. So, Egri had mentioned that this is one of those dangerous mistakes that playwrights or authors make where they believe that the conflict is smooth sailing even without knowing the hints of having a bad conflict. So, first of all, what is a jumping conflict? Jumping conflict is when the characters jump from one emotional plane to another, eliminating the necessary steps which leads to bad writing. So Egri had mentioned previously in the premise that emotion is a huge factor to a play since it drives the characters to act. So jumping conflict is when the characters lacked the necessary state of mind to another, meaning that there should be an obvious transition from one state of mind to the next. So, for example, if you're a thief, you cannot just immediately become an honest man the next day. So, there should be proper steps between that. So, let's move on to the next slide for some examples or something. So, here it says avoid static or jumping conflict at all costs. To do so, you must know in advance what road your characters travel. So basically, it's the journey to the next emotional state of mind that should matter. So like how did the character change? Was there a specific trauma along the way? Why did they change? Why is the most important part when we talk about conflict? So here are examples: drunkenness to sobriety, and then simplicity to pretentiousness, or fidelity to infidelity. So you can see that the above examples are representing two poles. The first is the starting point, and the second is the arrival point. So as you can see, in between those 2 points lies the intervening steps, meaning that between these points we should focus on the character's journey. So like between drunkenness and sobriety, there is like an empty space. So since this is an empty space, the playwright or author should fill this space by choosing characters that would believe and fight for their cause, anything that follows their premise. So their emotional state of mind should have a proper transition between these two poles. So look at this example from the play Adol's House. So jumping conflict is present here when the male protagonist asks fondly if Nora loved him. Then he suddenly sneered at her. So this conflict here has no transition at all, because if he had loved her, he wouldn't have immediately sneered at her in the next breath. So that's like one of the examples of a jumping conflict. Basically, the space between these 2 points should have a logical chain of events leading up to the character's sacrifice. It should make sense, like between the transition of both points. There should be a logical explanation for that, or a logical chain of events. So, and then real characters must be given a chance to reveal themselves, and we must be given a chance to observe the significant changes which take place in them. So we have established that there should be a logical chain of events between the 2 points. So the next step will be to study your characters as thoroughly as possible. This study will show, or like double check, if these characters are really capable of doing what the premise expects of them. So it really just leads all back to the premise again. Um, so conflict is capable of doing what the premise expects of them. So one great hint when the conflict is on track or does not jump is when it connects with the premise. So whenever a conflict lags, rises jerkily, stops, or jumps, always look to your premise. Is it clear cut? Is it active? Always remedy any fault here and then turn to your characters. Or it could be like perhaps your protagonist is too weak to carry the burden of the play. So this is an example of bad orchestration if your protagonist has a weak resolve to carry the burden or conflict of the play. So perhaps some of your characters are not growing constantly, it's best to convince your audience of the character's resolve. So if the character is well rounded in terms of the premise, then it will make the audience understand the character's every action and drama. So, like, it really explained why the character did what they had to do and etc. So, in conclusion, jumping conflict is the result of characters who lack the necessary transition from one state of mind to another. By showing the transition from one state of mind to another, we reveal the character's true self and understand why they chose to do something. So, conflict shows us the true character of a person, and this is the most important part because everyone hides behind a mask. But in conflict, their true self is revealed. If there is no conflict in a story, then we will never see who these characters really are. And as a result, the audience or us will not care what happens to them. So please make sure that in between or the empty space between both of the starting point and the arrival point should focus on the logical chain of events of the character's journey or whatever that leads to the conclusion of the premise. So it should make sense. It should be relatable to the audience. The journey and the character's resolve and actions itself should be able to convince the audience. So we want to know why, because this helps to prove the premise of the story. Why is the most important question when it comes to conflict. So, lastly, always base your conflict to the premise. The premise should drive the character and the conflict. So every line of your play, every move your character make must further the premise. So granted that there are many solutions for any given situation, your characters are permitted to choose only those which will help improve the premise. So you're on the right track if your conflict leads to the conclusion of the premise. So like I mentioned before, emotions are a huge factor to a play. So each character must feel intensely that the action dictated by the premise is the only action possible for the character. So according to Egri, a play is not an imitation of life, but the essence of life. So we've reached the end of my report. Thank you so much for listening.